Well, welcome everyone to this, the first ever book talk at ECPS. It's led by Zara and myself. We're so lucky today to be joined by Dr. Catherine Thorleifsen and Sabine Voss for a talk entitled The Attractions of Populist Nationalism, Insights from Anthropological Fieldwork Amongst the Radical Right. In this, Catherine will talk about her book, Nationalist Responses to the Crises in Europe. She's a researcher at the Centre for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo and has conducted extensive ethnographic fieldwork among supporters of the populist radical right in Europe and Israel. As well as her academic pursuits, Dr. Thorleifsen has carried out consultancy work for the UNDP, the World Bank, the European Commission, and a number of ministries on the dynamics of far-right radicalization. Sabine Volk is a PhD candidate, an early stage researcher in the EU Horizon 2020 project, Delayed Transformational Fatigue in Central and Eastern Europe, responding to the rise of illiberalism and populism. She's particularly interested in political culture of far-right populist grassroots politics in post-socialist Eastern Germany. I'm running out of breath to sing both your praises, so I'm going to stop there. But just to give you a rough overview of the formats, Catherine will introduce us to some of her ideas that she presents in her book for about 20 to 25 minutes. That will be followed by a discussion conducted with Sabine. And then we'll open up the floor to everyone to ask questions, which will last for about 15 to 20 minutes. You've heard quite enough from me, so I will hand over to Dr. Thorleifsen.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to join you today. It's almost like playing actually a bit of an old album, because I wrote this book back in 2018, and as we know, the world is moving fast forward in terms of political developments. But still, I'm very honored to present my work today. Now, so the background for my research was back in 2015, looking at the renationalization processes in Europe and also beyond. So across European context and global context, we have populist radical right actors that have obtained both power but also double-digit support on platforms that are protesting immigration, that are Eurosceptic, and also propagating authoritarian populism and nativism. So really my aim back in 2015, when I designed my research project as my postdoctoral project, it was, what drives local support for the populist radical right? And in order to answer that question, I embarked on anthropological fieldwork in two countries in the UK, more precisely in England, in a small town called Doncaster, located in South Yorkshire, and in Hungary, in Budapest, and also other towns and cities. Now, why did I choose England and Hungary back in 2015? This was before Brexit. It was also before Viktor Orban further consolidated his authoritarian populist regime in Hungary. Well, for me, in 2015, both UKIP and Jobbik, the two parties I ended studying, represented kind of two opposite poles of the party family we call the populist radical right. As we know, the populist radical right is characterized by populism, so pitting the homogeneous, pure people against the corrupt elites. It's characterized by authoritarianism, and it's characterized by nativism or exclusionary nationalism. Now, UKIP was then on paper representing more civic nationalism, and Jobbik was representing ethnic nationalism, even verging on neo-fascist features. And they also were quite two different contexts. So one, Britain, was kind of a post-colonial context, and Hungary was a more post-communist context, and also with quite different historical experience of diversification processes. So with these in mind, I moved to first Doncaster back in May 2015. And now to present my findings in the book that I published then in 2018, I engaged with the existing literature. At the time, there were two main theses developed in explaining what drives support for the populist radical rights, and they were predominantly based on analysis of macro data. So one was the economic insecurity thesis, that the rise of the populist radical rise, they write, is due to fast economic change and neoliberal restructuring of economies and subsequent inequality. Another body of literature says, well, actually, it's not the economy stupid, that stupid term kind of haunts me. It's a culture backlash against immigration and against diversification processes. And Kaufman, the British scholar, has perhaps published the most controversial thesis in this regard, saying that it's actually about a white shift. So not just only demographic change, but it's about kind of white backlash in protecting white populations against non-white others framed as threatening others. My critique of these two literatures is that they are quite dichotomous. And I will argue that it's either not either just economy or culture. As an anthropologist, and based on my findings, I will say it's a combination of converging so-called crises or globalization that are tied to both economic change, so neoliberal restructuring of economies. It's also tied to culture, and I would argue that culture in some of the places I've studied are very intimately linked to economic production. And it's also tied to the perceived threat or actuality of immigratory waves. And also, as Sabine mentioned before we started this presentation, is that I would also argue that history and local context matters. So much existing scholarship on the radical right is rather ahistorical, presenting this as a phenomenon that arose in the mid-2000s, when we know first and foremost these parties have been present in Europe at least for a very long time. Think about Jörg Haider's Freedom Party back in the 1980s. But also more importantly, that the emotions and memories that are mobilized by these radical right actors are based on developments from the early 90s and backward and forwards. So I'm suggesting that we need to take at least a 3-decade perspective in order to understand the current electoral breakthrough of the radical right. So one of the chapters in the book, I dive into the support for UKIP. Now, I'm kind of a bummer in the sense that I would say that we know the outcome of this, but when I did my fieldwork in 2015, I did not know that the United Kingdom was eventually going to exit the European Union. So I moved to Doncaster in 2015 in May. And that was the month when UKIP had obtained 24% in the local elections, and that was actually 20% more than in the previous election, and they were the second largest party after the Labour Party. And Doncaster is traditional Labour town. This was where also Ed Miliband, former Labour Party leader, had his seat. So I was curious to find out why did this Labour town turn into a purple UKIP town. And in order to understand that electoral breakthrough, one needs to go back to the early 1990s and look at the neoliberal restructuring of the economies under Thatcher, and also the disastrous effect it had on local mining communities in England. Now, the mining strikes of the late 1980s was still in living memory, and I did some archival work, so my method was multi-sided fieldwork. I also spent hours running through the all local newspapers to see what themes were kind of on the front page during this period. And you can see that there was a very strong nostalgia for the industrial period, as indicated with this front page of local newspapers. And all the print press from this period kind of was hinting at a better future that will soon arrive. But at this moment, Doncaster was a precarious place. It was very deprived. And in terms of the living conditions, they also then had to obtain economic support from elsewhere. Going to the local museum, there was this exhibition that was portraying Doncaster back in the days. And it also ended with we're making way for something new. And this newness was, I saw in culture production, was never defined. It was as if Doncaster lost its future when it's lost its industrial production. Now, in this space, there's been contestation of a new meaning production, of a new identity-making production in this post-industrial space. And at the same time, when I did fieldwork in 2015, existential insecurity was highly visible in the town that was very characterized by poverty. And I felt personally a bit ignorant since I lived several years in London, and Doncaster is only an hour and a half away by train from London. And at the same time, it is experienced by locals as an entirely different place. So some could afford a plane ticket to southern Spain, but not the train, a plane ticket to southern Spain, but not a train ticket to London. So we're seeing a really strong north-south divide within England in terms of these hotspots of deprivation. Now, the struggling white working class in Doncaster was trying to create new futures for themselves in the context also of rapid diversification. So while Doncaster used to be more homogeneous and a white place, it has underwent rapid diversification, particularly with the enlargement of the EU in 2004, with labour migrants from former communist countries such as Poland, Ukraine, and elsewhere. And you also had in-migrations from different places that creates a new sense of hyper-diversity in Doncaster. And some local residents welcomed this new diversity, but others were highly skeptical of it. Now, if you look back in the 1990s again, you see how the emergent diversity, ethnic, religious, and culture is being welcomed. To the right is also the front page of the local Doncapolitan newsletter that is talking about LGBTQ rights. So they're trying to both come to terms, but also to live in commonplace super diversity. At the same time, there was this incredibly nostalgia for the industrial past, and as Doncaster is the most tattooed town in England, many of my informants would inscribe symbols of the mining past on their bodies, and in that way commemorate their fathers and grandfathers. But in September, so I didn't know this when I chose Doncaster to be my field site, but in September, UKIP decided to launch their annual conference and launch their Brexit campaign in Doncaster. So that's when my also fieldwork kind of changed a bit, because I obtained access to elites. So while I had designed the project to be amongst ordinary voters, I had, in a way, this unique opportunity to also learn more about the mobilization strategies of the political elites. So I got to spend time with both Nigel Farage, the UKIP leader, and also his main advisor, Raheem Kassam, who was then on a leave from Breitbart London, where he was headed by Steve Bannon, to become his advisor. Now they launched this campaign out of the EU and into the world in Doncaster to say no to Europe, to protect our heritage, to take control of the borders and believe in Britain. And for Doncastrians that were nostalgically mourning the loss of an industrial past, this message of protecting borders and also some of the fuzzy heritage was very appealing. Sitting in the living room of a local UKIP politician, it was evident that whiteness was also produced through culture, nationalism. And you can see, I don't need to read out what he says, but we need to wrap ourselves in the flag of St. George. So he was an English nationalist. People want to belong. If we can't have nationalism, what are we then besides some people living in the land? No, we need to be proud of England. So why my informants were very cautiously not saying explicit racist things in terms of biological racism, they were definitely producing a sense of English whiteness in relation to immigrants marked as threats to imagined sameness. Now, I interviewed Nigel Farage about his party campaign, and he told me that they wanted to focus on radical Islam. And I was a bit surprised, because radical Islam was not really a theme that was mentioned by my informants on the ground. So that's why I developed an argument about how these local brokers actually translated these socioeconomic and cultural grievances on the ground into politics of fear that marks immigrants, in particular from Muslim majority countries, as an existential threat. And this campaign intensified in the months leading up to the Brexit referendum. As we can see here, authored with the input from Rahim Kassam, questions of border control, identity and security are issues of which the referendum will be determined. Now, in the discourses online, I identified an emergent civilizationism, what Roger Brubaker's called civilizationism. So it was not only focusing on protecting English culture heritage, but also Judeo-Christian heritage. And this was kind of a new theme that emerged. At the same time, there was also this propagating enemy images of a creepy Islam that is highly aggressive and creeping form of violent Islam that is coming to a neighborhood near you soon. So this was a book by Rahim Kassam with chapters from Malmö with rape. So it's really these violent imaginaries portraying all Muslims as a violent threat to the West, basically. Really that kind of polarized frame of interpretation that has been propagated since 9/11. Now, this is not a surprise, we know how it went. And this is how it was framed by Nigel Farage. This was a victory for real people, a victory for ordinary people, and a victory for decent people. So this is also a core feature of populism, is really representing himself as the voice of the entire good people, and not really respecting the voice of the other half of the people. Now, going to Hungary, I also sent your chapter, Sabine, where I followed the anti-immigration campaign in Hungary that same autumn in 2015. It's called Disposable Strangers, Far-Right Securitization of Migration in Hungary. And as in Doncaster, I had originally chosen a town of 18,000 people with the same kind of post-industrial profile to have a kind of good comparison. But I ended up also gaining access to the Jobbik elite. So Insight is actually gaining access to elites was more easier than I have taught. So they're obviously interested in being researched in a way as an object of scholarship. So this was the sign that welcomed me when I moved to Hungary in October 2015. So if you come to Hungary, you have to respect our culture. And if you come to Hungary, and did you know that since the start of the migration crisis, harassment of women in Europe has increased? And did you know that since the start of the migration crisis, more than 300 people have been killed in terrorist attack in Europe? So just as in Doncaster, this was also at the height of the refugee crisis. So the image of displaced forced migrants from Syria was actively used by populists in Europe to nurture the logic of a West that was endangered by people fleeing for their lives in need, basically. And this kind of propaganda was perhaps not as surprising in the Hungarian context, where Viktor Orban has already started to consolidate a kind of autocratic regime, sliding from illiberal democracy and openly rejecting liberal values, and also attacking the checks and balances of democracy. But the party, but in order to understand also, I would argue, the rise of illiberal populism under Viktor Orban in Hungary, one also needs to understand Jobbik. So Jobbik had 20% of the votes when I did fieldwork amongst them. And this was established actually as a neo-fascist party with vigilante movement. They had a paramilitary movement called the Magyar Garda that was banned before they tried to mainstream the party. Now Jobbik also has an irredenticist profile, longing for the territorial Greater Hungary that they lost after the First World War. So here I would argue it's not enough to go back to the 1990s to understand the appeal of populist nationalism. One has to go back to the First World War to understand how feelings of victimhood, how feelings of loss are mobilized in populist politics. Now, Jobbik's party program also had a core feature of populism, which is that we are the eternal victim of external forces. So this is the front page of their magazine, showing how Western press is lying, is not showing the truth, and is attacking innocent Hungary that just merely wants to defend the gates of Europe. It reads the coordinated campaign against Hungary. Now, for this fieldwork, I traveled with the deputy leader of Jobbik, Daniel Karpat, on his undercover campaign on migration. And we started in Budapest, but we ended up on the border in the north, in Ózd. We also traveled to Martonmasar and other small towns where they had so-called awareness meetings to raise awareness of the dangers of Muslim migration. And typically these meetings were also hosted in post-industrial towns with kind of similar socio-economic profile as Doncaster, with the kind of same deprivation and the same labor unemployment. And here you can see Daniel talking to locals, presenting the party in very kind of sober colors and with sober features and no kind of fascist visual symbols. And in this meeting, he said that it's actually Jews, so Jewish people, that are using Syrian migrants as a biological weapon to destroy the West. So I would argue that in 2015-16, the refugee crisis was used as a political opportunity structure to propagate kind of intersecting forms of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism is quite strong in Hungary. It's these old tropes of the Jew who wants to obtain world dominance. But during this crisis, it obtained an anti-Muslim layer. And we also saw how anti-Semitic tropes were mobilized during election campaigns, even in public spaces. Don't let George Soros have the final laugh. So the globalist that was threatening the sovereignty of Hungary. And most disturbingly was also the displays of white supremacy here with the mayor of a border town called Al-Shatalon. So when we went there, he was having these signs in the town, Al-Shatalon defends its tradition against radical Islam. And also, as you can see to the right, also against LGBTQ rights, in contrast to other radical right-wing parties in Western Europe. And speaking of the transnational connections, because in terms of visual culture, I noted also how the Hungarian radical right would mobilize similar images as UKIP, but I also noted the actual physical connection between politicians from the Hungarian far right that also moved to the White House. So Sebastian Gorka, for instance, he was establishing a political party with the former Jobbik deputy, and 10 years later, he had married an American citizen and was the key advisor to Donald Trump on issues of security and terrorism. And needless to say, his view on terrorism is basically very Islamophobic. So in the case of Hungary, white nationalism was evident, but also how masculinity was mobilized. This is the white European man that needs to rescue the endangered nation and civilization. And due to time, I don't have time to go into all the intricacies of these politics of fear, but it was combining different historical time periods, particularly from the interwar regime of Miklos Horthy, who we know was responsible for implementing multiple anti-Jewish legislation. And also historical revisionism, kind of this commemoration called around Miklos Horthy. And also statutes that were minimizing the role the Hungarian government had in the systematic deportation and genocide of 500,000 Hungarian Jews. And some would obviously protest these developments. So to sum up from my fieldwork, the insights I got about the workings and dynamics of populist nationalism. So on the demand side, it was primarily existential insecurity associated with fast changes, both post-industrial and post-communist insecurities related also to demographic change. But both culture and economics are drivers, and in some places, particularly in these post-industrial towns, they are mutually constitutive. So what is considered culture and way of life is linked to industrial production. And it's not only economics in GDP terms and unemployment, it can also be a fear of fall in status, so welfare chauvinism as well. Historical context, time periods, and memory inform the contemporary appeal of populist nationalism. And in terms of the supply side of populist nationalism, we have seen how new technologies and social media have also created the opportunity to translate local grievances into nationalist politics of fear that frame Muslim migrants or globalist elites as existential threats to national identity, culture, security, welfare, and way of life. And particularly in 2015, the migration crisis created this political opportunity structure for this effective politics of fear. So thank you very much for your patience. And I look forward to your questions.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Catherine. That was fascinating. Let's open it up to a discussion with Sabine. I'll hand over to you, Sabine.
Thank you. I have also some slides to share, so I will start with that. And I have loads of questions. It's funny, Catherine, that you say thank you for your patience. It's it's a really fascinating work and such rich empirical data. Like I really enjoyed both reading and both listening to you, and I particularly enjoyed the many pictures that you put on your slides. And I think this is really one of the strengths of ethnographic work, yeah, that we illustrate our findings, and it makes everything a bit more coming to life. So this was really great. Yeah, I have prepared a few slides, not that many, that will guide me through discussing some points that I thought were especially interesting, and especially to ask you many questions. Just to maybe also let you know from which perspective I'm looking at Catherine's work. So I'm myself an interdisciplinary scholar of the radical right, or the populist radical right, as we want to conceptualize them. I work on Eastern Germany, and I especially work on this, what you all see now on this slide. This is a picture I took myself in 2019 in Dresden, a city in Eastern Germany, where Germany's largest far-right populist movement is active, with the name Pegida. And in this movement, I conducted a couple of months of more classical ethnographic fieldwork, namely participant observation of their public protest. And especially since the pandemic set in and this movement went online with some of its activities, I have also conducted some virtual ethnographic fieldwork. And so I do think that Catherine and my own work, we share this cultural or interpretive approach to populist nationalism that is somehow located at this intersection of demand and supply side, yeah, as Catherine also made clarified in her presentation. And this approach, of course, then focuses on the construction of meaning at the local level, in local context, but at the same time locates it in the context of larger crises, yeah, that are not only local or regional, or not even only national, but they're actually global or globalized crises. And when I was thinking of how to organize this discussion, I decided to take advantage of this great name of our organization today, who invited both of us, the European Center for Populism Studies, that really combines some of my favorite concepts, namely Europe and populism and studies or methodology. And these will be the three dimensions along which I will just share some thoughts and a lot of questions, as I already said, on Catherine's work. So I will start with this very concept of populism or populist nationalism as we take it here. Yeah. From Catherine's book and articles, and also from this very beautiful presentation that she shared with us, I think the most important contributions to scholarship on the far right or nationalism that we get from it is, first of all, this linking demand and supply side, not separating the two, but look at how are they actually intertwined at local level. For example, Catherine writes about these forums on migration in Hungary, which, yeah, it must have been fascinating to go there. Or in my research, I look at these street demonstrations, where I really see how local activists and local politicians intertwine, how they are always in between this more political and a more activism level. What I really also enjoyed in reading Catherine's work was how she makes clear that these constructions of the outsider, yeah, be it the immigrant, other, or maybe also the idea of this elite, somehow corrupted, how these are actually shifting constructions over time. Yeah, how the other turns maybe from being the Jew or the Roma to actually being the Muslim immigrant in Hungary. Or on the other hand, in terms of these elites that are othered, how we see a transition from the elite, the outsider being the communist totalitarianism, or Brussels, the West, and this kind of concepts. And finally, what I also really enjoyed was how Catherine's work links this populist nationalist movements or actors at local level to these larger crises. And in this context, I would have some more questions that are also here on the slide on the right-hand side. It is great how this perspective can overcome this culture versus economy debate. And I do think that this case selection, yeah, it really helps us to see that. Maybe Catherine could, in the further Q&A, still elaborate a bit more how these two so different cases, and also other cases that she has looked at in Norway, or maybe even in Israel. I would be also fascinated to hear more about how you construed this dichotomy there. Furthermore, I would be interested in how populism, I don't really mind how we conceptualize it now, so we can go beyond these debates of ideational versus discursive framing or performative approach, but to what extent does it play a role in nationalism? Is it somehow also constitutive of nationalism, or is it kind of an added element? And what would be that added element? Is it mainly an anti-elitism, or is it more the idea of how we construct the people as pure, as kind of true or ordinary Hungarians, Brits, or in my research, it would be Germans. And it is so interesting now really to read these texts about what happened just a few years ago, how populist nationalism constituted itself in the context of the so-called migration crisis and in the aftermath of the economic crisis. Now we are in a very different type of crisis. And yeah, I'm interested, Catherine, how you conceptualize the link between our current crisis, namely the pandemic, and populist nationalism. Do we see, which kind of new grammars of exclusion do you see from this? But one hears sometimes that migrants are now seen as impure and as a certain health threat. Here in the cases that I look at in Eastern Germany, they would talk about migrants as not respecting enough the regulations. For example, now in times of fast, of Ramadan, that Muslims would disrespect social distancing rules. So I think maybe we see a new grammar of exclusion here. In order to keep this as more of a discussion event, maybe Catherine, you would like to already comment upon something, and then I have 2 more slides about different dimensions of your work.
Yes, thank you for a thorough reading of the chapters, and thank you also for linking it up to your own work, which I look forward to reading, and also for pointing to 3 areas for further exploration or explanation. And I will begin with the latest, because, as you know, if I had written the book today, it was probably nationalist responses to the pandemic in a way, because if the refugee crisis of 2015 was a political opportunity structure, certainly the COVID-19 pandemic crisis has shown how not just far-right actors, but illiberal autocrats across the globe has seized the opportunity to spread conspiracy theories and disinformation, from Bolsonaro to Trump to Erdogan to Viktor Orban to, well, the list is so long, unfortunately. But yes, so what we see is obviously that migrants and minorities are framed as a threat to the body politics. And we know this also has a long history during previous health crisis. We saw in the initial phases how different far-right actors would ascribe nationality to the virus. So it's the China virus, or China's using the virus as a biological weapon. Or we saw also that even Viktor Orban tried to ascribe it to immigrants, and some tried to push for emergency laws, politicizing public health in order to consolidate power further or to attack human rights, as was also the case in Hungary, one of the cases I followed most closely. So yes, the pandemic is definitely being weaponized by far-right actors to propagate their own kind of grammars of exclusion, and it's also being, you see also not just new grammars of exclusions, but new coalitions forging between classical far-right actors that are now protesting together with anti-vaccination protesters that unite in these anti-COVID lockdown demonstrations, as is the case in the Netherlands, and also the US, and also actually in Norway, where you have QAnon conspiracy theorists and neo-fascist conspiracy theorists that come together with people that are not necessarily ideological, but protesting COVID-19 measures and regulations. In terms of the classical culture versus economic debate, so in the sense that economy matters, we are seeing an economic fallout of the current pandemic that will most likely also fuel further support for radical right parties in Europe and beyond the years ahead. So we've seen how these parties have kind of failed to grow during the pandemic due to the rally around the flag effect. So people, when they also experience public health crisis, they tend to flock around established leaders in a way. But now we also see these radical right actors that go back to the populist rhetoric, kind of presenting themselves as voices of the little people that are not heard. And I think also the case I'm trying to make is that I think it's a false dichotomy at times. So we know, of course, the economic drivers, it ties to also unemployment, and then you have the fuzzy concept of culture. But I would say that both in the Rust Belt in the US, in Doncaster, in Eastern Germany, in parts of Hungary, some of these post-industrial places, they do have in living memory a time of prosperity and security and secure futures. So that's why it's experienced so destabilizing. But it's also a generational aspect, because very often it is kind of parents that will mourn the loss of the future for the children. So it's the fear of downward social mobility. And in terms of, when I say that the culture experience is tied to economic production, so at least in Doncaster, working men's club were the place you went after you've kind of finished your working hours in the mine. So all kind of places in the community where you forged friendship and community, a sense of belonging, were kind of tied an extension of jobs that gave a certain pride and identity. And I'm not romanticizing hard mining work, but it's certainly my informants would kind of laugh about the shopping center and the call centers, kind of, that there was kind of nothing new that could supply that kind of thick experience. And in terms of how to define the role of populism as ideational, discursive, and framing, I would say there's a great article by Roger Brubaker that's called "Why Populism," which explains kind of the various directions that populism can go, both in terms of internal and external, horizontal, as a discursive, as an ideological, thin ideology. But I'm actually more interested, I think, so the fieldwork approach that you and I have done, I think can also add an element that's missing largely from the literature in the other studies, and that's the embodied dimension, so the performative elements, and that's observing by analyzing culture practice. You can actually see how populism is thickening by adding nativist symbols, by adding these very rich symbols and embodied culture practices that can capture different temporalities and kind of lead you into that nostalgic yearning for the past and still believe in kind of a better future. So that's when I go to this, you know, in Hungary, to these rituals, or even the political spectacle at a UKIP conference, it's really what they're doing. It's kind of this embodied populism in a way that I think is somehow also lacking a bit in my work, which is also tends to be a bit discursive, analytic when I analyze some of the images at least. So I think there's potential there, yeah. So thank you. I hope there are more questions, but thank you so much for these thought-stimulating interventions, Sabine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine, for developing a bit more on these points. It's, I could now again comment on everything, but maybe just about this last point that you made about populism. I know that a lot of research on the far right or nationalism actually criticizes this hype around populism, and is not really convinced that this is a necessary or useful notion or lens for us. I do believe it really captures what is going on the ground. And of course, I'm biased by my research, but I can see in these demonstrations that I have been in how populism is not only a discursive construct of we the people, but actually in demonstration, we the people is performed, right? So the people as a group, be it ordinary, hardworking Germans, usually these ideas resonate alongside white or racist ideas. They are really performed on the street with bodies and with the presence in the on the ground. So this is really, really fascinating. I would, if I may, I still have some questions for you. And the second kind of broader topic I would like you to comment upon is the idea and the ideal of Europe that resonates in these populist nationalisms that you have looked at. And your text and also your presentation really highlighted these, I think, these shifting ideas of Europe between, on the one hand, this kind of real existing supranational organization, so the EU, which is framed usually as very negatively, both in terms of UKIP and Jobbik, but on the other hand, also as a very positively imagined cultural community or civilization that is imagined as kind of pure and usually as Christian. And in this context, I do also think that your findings really gave us some new insights into what actually within Europe as a region, how smaller regions, namely Western Europe on the one hand and Central and Eastern Europe on the other hand, are kind of reimagined and reperformed. And these new ideas that resonate in UKIP, maybe in UKIP a bit less, but especially in Jobbik, especially in the Hungarian local and grassroots far right, we see novel imaginations of Central and Eastern Europe. And yeah, as I work in a project that deals mostly or only with Central and Eastern Europe, this is really a point that I'm fascinated about. So how the image of Western Europe is slowly shifting from having embodied the true Europe towards this idea that Western Europe is somehow impure due to immigration, that it represents what you term the Swedish dystopia. And on the other hand, Central and Eastern Europe's meaning is shifting from being always historically construed as non-European or somehow less European towards actually representing the true Europe, yeah, because it constitutes a Christian bulwark against this imagined threat of Islam. Yeah. In this context, on how populist nationalisms conceptualize Europe, I would be interested in what is your take on how can we actually call these European nativisms that transcend national borders in Europe. And there are some ideas such as the pro-European nativism, others speak of transnational populism, Miller-Eadquist talks even of a more global far right. And yeah, maybe you can comment upon that. Maybe you have a completely different concept that you like. And also from your experience in Hungary, I would really like to know how would you now reconceptualize Central and Eastern Europe? Many scholars still see it as somehow backward, as catching up. Yeah, that was, I guess, the big ideas of the 1990s, that Central and Eastern Europe would be catching up with the West. But to some extent, it has been foreshadowing future political developments. Yeah, especially Orban in Hungary has to some extent foreshadowed Trump in the States or Bolsonaro in Brazil. So this would be my second set of questions.
Thank you for those wonderful interventions and questions. So let me begin about how to conceptualize populism across European contexts. So what we are seeing, we're seeing multiple forms of populist nationalism. So multiple reimaginings of the nation in relation to differentiated others that follows also historical trajectories. I'm currently working doing digital fieldwork, so I'm writing a piece on cyberfascism. So speaking of how I conceptualize some of these developments is that what we see now is how emerging new technologies are also not only allowing the transatlantic fast spread of ideas and the connection between activists that can use the similar tropes and images, but it also then that those new technologies have also kind of consequences for how we conceptualize populist nationalism. It's not just like one actor in one particular nation state, but they are increasingly linked in digital networks where they can very fast co-produce and exchange ideas. And I think that was very evident with the both Brexit campaign, with the Trump campaign, and also actually with the Jobbik campaign, although I haven't theorized too much about their online activities. So I think you mentioned, Sinta Miller-Eadquist has, what was the concept, transnational?
Like a global far right, even.
Yeah, no, I would say definitely, yes, the global far right, in the sense, of course, it's across the globe in multiple different geographical contexts, but I will also say we're looking at the transnationalization of ideas, so it's the networked far right. But of course, they also, as you say, they operate, as in the case of Jobbik, as you know, both the local level, the national level. It relates to Europe and then to civilization. So we're looking at different scales of mobilizing ideas across scales. And in terms of the autocratic developments in Hungary, they have used their geographical position combined with history to reposition themselves as those that are defending not only the gates of Europe, but the kind of pure form of Europeanness that should be illiberal, it should be conservative, based on Christian values, and the heteronormative family. So they are kind of then promoting, small nation state of 10 million people, promoting a model for the future Europe that is in direct opposition to liberal democracy or universal human rights. And that's what we're seeing currently. It's the contestation of the future of, liberal Europe, basically, because there are even EU member states that are openly advocating for, yes, we want democracy, but we don't want liberal values. So advocating for the supremacy of some certain groups of others. Yes, and of course, in some of my Jobbik informants said, they felt demonized by the Western press. They felt misunderstood by Western academics. They felt, why don't you understand that we're just trying to protect Europe? That kind of, we're not the bad guys. And it's you in Norway and Sweden that are being contaminated by multiculturalism and diversity. So there was this kind of self-image of really being the defender of the endangered Western Europe in a way. But thank you for very good questions.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I see that in my research on this Eastern German movement at a kind of inner German scale, that for a long time the overarching idea would be that Eastern Germany has to catch up with the West, whereas now these far-right activists will argue that, well, we do not want to be like the West. We would like to re-erect some kind of boundary because we do not want to become as Islamized as the West is already. Yeah. So this is it really reconstrues what is the true Europe and how Europe wants to be. Yeah, interesting. And for them, of course, for the Eastern German populist nationalisms, Hungary is a big role model even. Yeah. I would have
some really important issues. We have a few questions in the chat, so I suggest we move on to those quickly, and then if we have some time, then we can circle back to some of these. We have a question from Bulent Keens. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Would you like me to read that out, or would you like to read it yourself?
You can read.
Okay. The question is, in the light of the dehumanizing concepts such as human waste, biological weapons, and pollutants that you had to use in one of your articles as trying to define the rough approaches of anti-immigrant far-right or populist radical right movements against Muslim immigrants in Europe, especially in Hungary and Eastern Europe, and in more general terms, in the light of the reality of rising far-right movements and parties across the continent, what kind of Europe is waiting for us in the coming 10 to 20 years? And what is your analytical projection or prediction on these dangerous tendencies?
Thank you very much. So predictions, Europe 2041. Yes, so looking, well, my predictions now is, as I said, what I'm writing on now, I have moved into looking at cyber-fascism and the global spread and co-authoring of neo-fascism in digital subcultures, basically. So it's even more extreme than these political parties. But in light of that, what I think we're looking at, as I said, is that we're looking at the spread of neo-fascist ideas or far-right ideas, such as exclusionary nationalism, through new technologies that have potentially very destabilizing effects for democracies, and certainly for liberal democracies. So one trend is obviously this ongoing contestation of liberalism in Europe that have ramification for minority rights and human rights. But the other, I'm also more concerned about, not more, but also concerned about, because as we've seen that democracies in Europe are not necessarily immune to autocratic tendencies, or to even turning into autocracies, and particularly younger democracies. And that's happening in a time when genocide is still living memory. There's still Holocaust survivors. And now we have a generation of eyewitnesses to these atrocities that will die. And we have also a new generation that are actively, as in the case of Hungary, falsifying history and propagating historical revisionism. So I'm in a way, I'm an optimistic person, but based on historical experience and also current tendencies, I will not be an alarmist, but I'm definitely seeing how these globalized networks and the rapid spread of conspiracy, dehumanizing conspiracy theories can have serious ramification for liberal democracy and also for diversity. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. If there are any more questions, please put your hand up. We have another question here. Would you like to ask it?
Yes, my name's Erdem. I would like to ask something about the civilizational aspect of these far right discourses. My question is about the to what extent we can consider this civilizational aspect as a kind of pan-European nativism or pan-European nationalism against the outsiders. Because in your study, as far as I understand, you make a connection between the existential concerns of these working class people living in this post-industrial age, their nostalgia for the industrial past, and there are similarities in the case of UK, well, that small town that you studied, and Hungary. So there is a connection between these outsiders, right? Mostly the people coming from non-European parts, well, Muslims, of course, and the uncertainty of the working class people living in this post-industrial age, right? So here, I'm wondering, the civilizational aspect in the case of Hungary, for example, the defender of Europe, or in UK. Okay, Muslim people are coming from non-European parts of the world, and other people of color are coming from non-Western parts of the world. But the reaction against diversity is not solely directed at these Muslim migrants or other people of color coming from non-European parts of the world. In the case of Hungary, it's also against Roma people, and Roma people, well, lived in Hungary for centuries. They are European, right? And in UK, there are Roma people having lived in it for a long time as well. So there is intra-European immigration as well, right? In the case of UK, there are many people coming from Romania, Bulgaria, Poland. In Hungary, these far-right discourses are against Roma people who have lived in Hungary for centuries. So here, I'm wondering how this civilizational aspect plays out, because Roma people or the East European migrants in UK are European as well, right? If you're talking about a kind of pan-European nationalism, pan-European nativism, these people are being excluded as well. These people, although they are not technically outsiders because they haven't migrated from non-Western parts of the world. They lived in Europe. They have been part of the European society. I think this civilizationalism seems to be a kind of misleading cover for white supremacism, right? So there is that implicit racism in that civilizationalism discourse. Do you think that civilizationalism discourse is a kind of cover for that white supremacist racism?
Yes, well, first and foremost, I would say that your point is so important to raise, that populist nationalism is also reinforced in relation to members with citizenships of the nations that are being framed as internal others. So all kinds of nationalisms are based also upon excluding minorities. And Doncaster actually is the home to the largest Roman traveller population in England. I forgot to say that initially. So they have, speaking of, experience with diversity, they have these new grammars of exclusion are also based upon older grammars of exclusion that are directed at Roma in the case of the UK and Hungary, and also in Hungary in the case of the Jewish minority population. But I would say in terms of civilizationism, as I said, I think in this digital hyper-connected era we're living in now, so we see how ultranationalism, despite its stress on this need for national palingenesis, it can actually also acquire this transnational dimension that call for a reborn civilizational order. So you can have both the nationalism that is focused on protecting national borders and the nation state, but at the same time it calls for a reborn of a civilization that is also imagined as pure. And yes, when it's propagated by white nationalists, it's definitely also a form of white nationalism. So, but I think it's, when we analyze this phenomenon, it's important to see how different scales are used in discourse and practice. Some are focused on territorial borders, where you have super diversity and different minoritized others. And some are based on imagining a Western space and imagining it as, for instance, Christian. And in the case of white supremacy, it will be imagining that space as white as well. Yeah, but thank you for very good interventions.
Thank you for that question, Edem. Do you have a follow-up? We haven't, but please do stick your hands up in the chat if you'd like to.
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
Thanks for the answer.
Thank you for your question. We have another question now from Samia.
Hi, thank you for this, these two great contributions. And I'm a scholar of religion, and I was wondering in these far-right populist movements and their reaction or opposition against the liberal values, how much secularism finds itself in the opposition side? Like, can you say that these populist movements are also against or anti-secularism? And do they see secularism as one of the reasons for the endangerment of the European values in the face of the Muslim immigrants, who are also the products of the religious revival of the last 2 or 3 decades? So they're definitely, in that sense, different from the kind of Muslims that would migrate in the 60s or even 70s. So there is definitely a more clear visibility to the new migrants. And in this sense, where do you see secularism playing out in these debates?
Well, thank you. There's a different difference there between, I would say, Western Europe and Eastern Europe, because, for instance, in the case of the UK or even in Norway, you see how there's been the emergence of this, what Brubaker calls identitarian Christianism. So it's not just about, it's religion, then it becomes more than belonging than actual belief. So you will have politicians that propagate Islamophobic discourse as a threat to Christian heritage and or a threat to national identity anchored in Christian heritage and values and trajectories. But they're not necessarily religious themselves, and in terms of church attendance, they will not go to church. Whereas you see in Eastern European context, and certainly in Hungary, you see how religion is actively being used. I mean, Viktor Orban, also has the blessing of the Calvinist church, and Jobbik also actively uses Christianity to sanctify their ideology, even though actually also church attendance is comparatively low in Hungary, but it's certainly being instrumentalized. And there's also being used to protect the Christian nation / heteronormative anti-LGBTQ right family. So yes, and actually one of the leaders I interviewed, he said, that the Western Europe has lost touch with its spirituality. And he would interestingly say that he had traveled to Islamic countries, and been greatly inspired by their spirituality, and he was now convinced that in order to fight the darkness of globalization, you need to fight liberalism and kind of reconnect with spiritualism. I write about that in my article. So certainly using spirituality as a way to re-sanctify the nation. Yeah. But the role of so that's also, you know, if we talk about liberalism as one area of contestation in future Europe, certainly also religion, secularism versus religion is also one of those areas of contestation. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your question. Please do keep adding questions, putting your hands up if you'd like to ask something. Just while we wait for someone, I had a question. I was interested about how you talked about making way for something new. That phrase seemed incredibly appropriate. I think of course, it found this neoliberal impulse found its epitome in Britain, I suppose, in New Labour, and it kind of reminded me of the slogan "New Labour, New Britain." And of course, neoliberalism also depends on certain social methods. And so I totally buy your description of the links between cultural backlash, identity, and the economy. A lot of far-right populists, I guess, focus their policy mainly on identity, but leave the economic grievances basically unresolved. And based on your research, is there a way to expose that to people more widely in a way that's generally accessible?
Can you rephrase the question? So to expose the economic...
To expose the sense that for many Brexit voters, for instance, they thought that the kind of culture wars that accompanied a lot of the Brexit campaign, they thought that engaging with some of those would also have a knock-on effect on their own personal finances. Mm-hmm. Whereas in fact, that's revealed to be false. And I think you can see a similar effect in the US as well. So I'm wondering to what extent you can expose that, because these kinds of parties can always find new people to demonize and blame those economic grievances on someone else, of course.
Yeah, I think it's, well, as we've seen in terms of drivers, so we know that economic precarity and unemployment are factors in these post-industrial towns, but there are always promises that will not be fulfilled. But then is the question, does it really matter? Because, you know, for those who are shattered by forces of globalization, are feeling despair, it's just this kind of feeling of agency, of mobilizing against the system and against the globalist elites, so the little people against the demonized elites that are detached from our lives and don't understand our everyday lives. So it's that sense of agency. And there's also been some wonderful sociological work in the US by Ariel Hochschild, Strangers in Our Own Land, and Catherine Kramer, you know, the demand for dignity, that really shows it's, so it's not that they say it's not the economy, but they show that the resentment for liberal elites is so high amongst people who feel really left behind, who are kind of, in a popular phrase, well, basically they are really left behind and feeling, you know, senses of great despair and insecurity for the future. So I think it's, so I think although these promises, you know, we promise we will bring back job and protect your welfare, that might not materialize, but at the same time, we might still see also people voting even against, you know, their own interest in a way. And when it's because you have identity politics being propagated that kind of trumps that the economic arguments. I don't know if that answered your question entirely, but
yeah, it went some way to it. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? I saw some stray hands popping up just now. Hello. We have a question. I'm from Erkan.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for this good presentation. So I think what you said is very relevant, not only for UK or Hungary, but for other European countries, EU countries like France as well, especially for these mining communities that faced some crisis. And there's a kind of nostalgia for industrial period. For example, the northern France, they have the same issue. And what is interesting, for example, there is a little town, Henin-Beaumont. So at northern France till 2014, they voted almost for left parties, Communist Party or Socialist Party. And then 2014, they voted for Le Pen. And there's a huge, there was a huge change and huge debate at that time. So, so what you said is very relevant to explain it specifically, to see how this shift happened. But another issue is when we looked at who voted for the Le Pen. So these are mostly coming from the younger generation. The group of the age is between 18 and 28. So about 40-45% of the votes coming from this younger generation. You talked about this nostalgia, but nostalgia is, may explain these kind of things, especially for the older generation. But how is nostalgia economy explain or affect this younger generation? Do you have any kind of findings from your fieldworks from the UK, or especially for the mining town, the town that they had the same problem?
Yes. Well, this is such a great question, because I have reflected upon that. So in Doncaster, yes, it was primarily the older generation and left behind that would express this industrial nostalgia that was in turn appropriated by UKIP in their political campaigning. But I think what's really interesting is that in Hungary, it was the Jobbik, the Movement for a Better Hungary, that is led by politicians born in the 80s, so my age basically. And they are also based in the urban centers, and even in the post-industrial towns, you have the mayor of Osd, where I worked, who's born in 1989. He's called the Wizard of Osd. And they're all into not only nostalgia for the mining past, but they're nationalist entrepreneurs. They're creatively and eclectically reinventing a new form of nationalism based on nostalgia for different time periods. So they're using that time periods to create this cycle of victimhood and cycles of heroic defense, going back to the loss of territory after the Trianon Agreement, going back to 1956 and the failed uprising against communism, going back to transition to democracy, going back to the migration crisis 2015. So they have this kind of, there's what Timothy Snyder would call eternity politicians. You know, they are all into history. Actually, they are, the founders of this party are historians. Daniel Carpet, my main informant, was actually, he majored in history, but he's also the editor of a historical magazine. So I think it's all about, speaking on the supply side, it's using religion, but also history to thicken populism, to make it stick to people.
Thank you so much for that question. I think, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. But thank you to everyone who's taken part, and thank you especially to Catherine and Sabine for their wonderful contributions today. Okay, we have, I think, another event's coming up soon on May the 11th, if I'm right.
No, May 26th.
May 26th, with Sarah Kamali and Todd Green to discuss Sarah's book on white nationalists and militant Islamists in the USA. But I hope you can all join us then. Thank you everyone who's contributed today. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for organizing this.
Very much. Thank you.
Bye. Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.